Have you ever witnessed someone being underestimated until they stood up and silenced an entire room? What started as an ordinary morning at Brookhaven courthouse turned into a seismic event that shook Georgia's entire judicial system. A police officer known for his arrogance slapped a woman in public, without knowing that she was the most powerful judge in the state. But the story didn't stop there, because that slap didn't just strike one person's face. It cracked open a web of deception that had lasted for decades. And that woman, 63 years old, calm eyes unshaken, chose not to stay silent. You won't believe what happened next. Stay with this story because it's not just about justice. It's about the courage of one woman who dared to bring light into a place long ruled by shadows. Brookhaven, a historic city nestled in the American South, was slowly waking up. Morning light filtered through the branches of century-old oak trees, stretching across the marble steps leading into the city courthouse. Everything was unfolding as usual. A security guard nodding and greeting, clerks organizing files, and a few young lawyers quietly exchanging notes before court. No one suspected that this morning would mark the beginning of a shockwave that would rattle the entire legal system they once believed was solid. Through the large wooden doors stepped Judge Evelyn Cross, 63 years old, her silver hair neatly tied back, her pace steady but far from slow. She wore no judicial robe, just a simple gray blazer, as if to maintain calm before the coming storm. With over 3 decades in the justice system, Evelyn knew all too well, the most extraordinary events often begin in absolute silence. On the docket that day was a minor case, a 17-year-old boy accused of spray painting graffiti on a park wall. No one was paying much attention. But Evelyn was different. Her intuition, sharpened like a blade over 30 years, was whispering to her that something wasn't right. As she neared courtroom 3, she heard a voice echoing inside, loud, domineering, and laced with unmistakable disdain. The door was slightly ajar. Inside stood Officer Nathan Briggs, arms crossed, his expression a mix of arrogance and coldness. He didn't know Evelyn was watching from outside, and perhaps he wouldn't have cared. Nathan Briggs was no stranger to Brookhaven's legal circles. A veteran officer, but also a man trailed by a string of internal complaints: excessive force, abuse of authority, discriminatory language. Yet somehow, those reports always mysteriously vanished. Young colleagues avoided discussing him. Prosecutors, seemingly used to compromise, chose silence. Evelyn stepped inside, saying nothing, simply observing. The room held only a few people, a public defender sitting pensively next to the thin, withdrawn teenage defendant. The boy stared down, avoiding all eye contact, his hands clenched as though trying not to shake, and Briggs still standing there, commanding the room as if he were the one running the court. "We should have started by now," Briggs muttered, not even bothering to look around. "I don't have all day." Evelyn didn't respond immediately. She quietly moved to the clerk's desk, picked up the case file, and flipped through the pages. Every word confirmed her instinct. This was a simple case. The boy had been caught by a park employee with spray paint, no weapon, no resistance. So why was Nathan Briggs, who typically handled only serious cases, even here? She looked up, her deep brown eyes scanning the room once more. From Briggs's body language to the nervous demeanor of the staff, to the fear etched into the boy's face, everything told her that something was very, very wrong. Not simple at all. Evelyn turned and walked toward the robbing room. She knew that when she returned in her official capacity, the dynamics in that courtroom would shift, and perhaps not in the way anyone in that room expected. They thought today would be just another routine morning. They were wrong. When Judge Evelyn Cross returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere shifted, though only those perceptive enough could sense it. Her posture was upright, her steps measured, carrying the weight of both resolve and experience. But Officer Nathan Briggs didn't notice. He was leaning against the witness stand, arms crossed, his face etched with impatience. As Evelyn entered, Briggs glanced at her, then looked away, as if she were just another clerk or court administrator. His glance was brief, but dripping with contempt, the kind of look that had been cast at black women throughout the long history of the legal system. "This is ridiculous," Briggs said loudly, clearly intending for everyone in the room to hear. "Don't know why they let people like that be in charge. This is a courtroom, not a daycare." The words landed like stones. One observer, a young attorney seated in the back, frowned slightly. The teenage defendant still had his head down, shoulders trembling subtly. Evelyn had yet to take her seat on the bench. She stood beside the clerk's desk, eyes cold, unmoved. "Officer Briggs," she said, her voice calm and deliberate, "this is a courtroom. and I expect you to conduct yourself accordingly." Briggs turned fully to face her for the first time, but his gaze lacked any shred of respect. He smirked, dropping his voice as if sharing a joke. "Oh, sorry. I didn't know who you were. Seems like everyone's trying to play judge these days." The room froze. Evelyn said nothing. She stepped up one level toward the bench, still not seated. Her silence wasn't submission. It was a final warning, a chance for Briggs to reconsider, to pull himself back. But he didn't. Instead, in a moment of senseless escalation, Officer Briggs stepped forward, a flicker of unexplained rage in his eyes. And then smack! A slap exploded across Evelyn's face. The sound, sharp, cold, struck the room into total silence. Everyone stopped breathing. Pens halted mid-sentence. Someone dropped a coffee cup. Eyes widened all around, but no one dared speak. Evelyn didn't fall. She didn't flinch. She simply stood there, her face unchanged except for the vivid red mark spreading across her left cheek, the unmistakable brand of an offense that could not be erased. Briggs stepped back, as if slightly startled by what he had just done, yet there was no remorse in his eyes. On the contrary, he snorted and muttered, "Who do you people think you are?" Evelyn calmly raised a hand to smooth her hair, then turned toward the judicial panel. A court staffer stood up abruptly. Another began pulling out a phone to record. No one in that courtroom, from the clerks to the lawyers, the defendant, even the bailiffs, could pretend this was still just another hearing. They had all just witnessed something that shattered legal boundaries, shattered power structures, and shattered the moral compass of the room. And the man who had crossed all of those lines hadn't realized he had just slapped the wrong person. Not a nameless woman, not a court clerk, but Judge Evelyn Cross, the very woman who holds the power of justice in this courtroom. After the unexpected slap, a lightning strike in clear skies, the entire courtroom felt as if it had been drained of air. Those present seemed to forget how to breathe. Every eye turned toward Judge Evelyn Cross, the woman who had just been assaulted by a police officer, right in the sacred space of justice. Evelyn stood still for a moment. The red mark was still visible on her face, but her expression hadn't changed. Calm, dignified, as though she bore not just a case on her shoulders, but the very foundation of morality itself. Without haste, she turned and walked toward the judge's bench. Along the way, she quietly opened a small cabinet, pulled out a black robe, the ultimate symbol of judicial authority. The soft sound of fabric brushing against her skin echoed faintly in the thick air. As Evelyn draped the robe over her shoulders, a wave of cold and fire spread through the room. It wasn't the fire of rage, but the weight of history, of order, and of a boundary that had just been crossed. Step by step, she ascended the bench. Briggs was still frozen in place, his face pale, his eyes blinking rapidly as if he couldn't believe what had just happened. Below, in the rows of observers, lawyers, clerks, notaries, and a few young journalists, no one had fully regained composure. When Evelyn sat in the judge's chair, her eyes scanned the courtroom. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to bang a gavel. She only needed to speak. And the truth would be undeniable. "Allow me to introduce myself," she began, her voice steady yet resonant like a tolling bell. "I am Judge Evelyn Cross, presiding over this morning's hearing." A wave of invisible sound swept through the room. Someone dropped their pen. Another raised a hand to their mouth. On the defendant's side, the skinny teenager sat upright, wide-eyed, shocked, and deeply moved. Briggs blinked, stepping back as if the ground beneath him had slipped away. He looked around, searching for an ally, an excuse, or just a lifeline amid this nightmare. But no one came to his defense. No one dared. Because everyone understood that in that moment, the line between misconduct and crime had been shattered. A police officer, someone trained to uphold the law, had just struck a sitting judge in the middle of her duties, all because he didn't recognize that power does not lie in appearance or skin color, but in integrity. Evelyn gently tapped the gavel. The small thunk echoed like a tremor through the floor, more powerful than any scream. "Order," she said, "and let it be entered into the record. Officer Nathan Briggs committed an act of violence against a judicial official inside this courtroom without cause, without warning, and without remorse." Briggs opened his mouth as if to speak, but stopped. No sound emerged. Because now, not only had his actions been laid bare, but so had the entire mechanism of impunity and arrogance that once shielded them. Every eye turned to Evelyn not with pity, but with awe. As for Briggs, he was no longer a police officer. He was now simply a man who assaulted a judge before dozens of witnesses, and a woman who would never bow. Silence continued to reign in that courtroom, but it was no longer shock. It was awakening. The atmosphere in the courtroom was still tense as a drawn bowstring, but now, that silence carried a different weight. It was no longer shock, it was the signal of a tremor about to begin, slow yet unstoppable. Judge Evelyn Cross sat upright, her gaze sharp as a blade as it swept across Officer Nathan Briggs's stunned face. She didn't need to raise her voice. The weight of each word she spoke, delivered with the precision of a verdict etched in stone, was enough to silence the entire room. According to Section 7, Article 93 of the Brookhaven State Penal Code, Evelyn declared, her voice calm but cold as steel, any act of assault or threat of violence against a judicial officer while performing official duties shall be considered a second-degree felony. Briggs blinked rapidly, his mouth twitching as he struggled to swallow each word. No one came to his defense, no prosecutor interrupted to shift the focus. Everyone remained seated, as though held in place by an invisible force, not the power of a title, but the force of integrity. Evelyn continued, "This hearing will be postponed to ensure a fair investigation process. In the meantime, I request the court clerk, Ms. Peterson, to record the following in the minutes. The act of slapping a judge in the face, witnessed by at least 14 individuals and captured by 2 security cameras installed at the west and east corners of the courtroom." The sound of typing echoed quickly as the clerk documented her statement. Briggs grew increasingly disoriented, his eyes darting around for support. The aggression from earlier had vanished, replaced by unmistakable fear and confusion. "Your Honor," he began, voice faltering. I didn't know you were a judge. I thought it was just a disruptive civilian. I was just trying to maintain order." Evelyn tilted her head, her eyes never leaving the crumbling face of the man who had moments ago stood in the courtroom like a self-appointed deity. "And if I had been a civilian, Officer Briggs, do you believe hitting a woman without cause would have been permissible?" No one spoke. She didn't need to shout. Her composure was the sharpest cut to the shell of his authority. Briggs lifted his hand, then let it drop. The fleeting glance he cast at his fellow officers in the back row was a silent plea for rescue. But in return, he saw only cold faces, silent, averted. Some had already looked away. A few young attorneys and reporters had begun raising their phones to record. Now Evelyn lowered her voice, though each word still rang with chilling clarity. "From this moment forward, Officer Nathan Briggs is to be temporarily suspended from duty as a witness and is to be placed under criminal investigation for assaulting a judicial officer. Any further actions or statements outside of protocol may result in immediate detainment." She turned to the officer standing by the courtroom door, who had until now remained motionless. "Officer Morales, can you confirm the courtroom cameras were functioning normally today?" "Yes, Your Honor," he replied firmly. "Both cameras recorded continuously. Footage is stored directly on the courthouse security server." Evelyn nodded, then spoke again without so much as glancing at Briggs. "It's strange how some only begin to understand the consequences when the red light on the camera turns on." A subtle shockwave seemed to pass through the gallery. Briggs opened his mouth again, but this time, no sound came out. And as silence settled once more, something became clearer than ever. The truth had just been dragged into the light. And it didn't need to scream to be heard. It only needed someone unafraid to stand and call it by its name. Evelyn Cross had done just that, not just for herself, but for everyone who'd ever been silenced by injustice wearing the mask of righteousness. That afternoon, as the sunlight began to slant through the tall glass windows of the Brookhaven courthouse, Judge Evelyn Cross didn't return to her office as usual. Instead, she walked straight into the records archive room where thick case files filled the wooden shelves, silently waiting to be opened. But today, Evelyn wasn't there to read the past. She was there to call it into the light. "Start with a list of every case in which Officer Nathan Briggs was the arresting officer, lead investigator, or primary witness in the last 10 years, she ordered, not loudly, but with a tone no one dared to ignore. 2 administrative staff exchanged a glance, then quickly got to work. In less than an hour, the preliminary list stretched across 3 pages. Over 70 cases, spread throughout low-income neighborhoods, most involving young men of color. Evelyn wasn't surprised, but she was hurt. "Keep filtering," she said, her voice lower now. "Pull any case with complaints related to coercion, excessive force, unlawful detention, and any file that was flagged for review but later dismissed without clear explanation." The more they filtered, the more names emerged, and not just Briggs. Repeating patterns began to show. The same prosecutor signing off, the same investigator omitting notes, the same string of security cameras that coincidentally malfunctioned. Evelyn sat in thought, surrounded by the cold air of the AC and the colder truths on the page. She knew this system like the back of her hand, and she also knew that to change it, punishing one man wouldn't be enough. She would have to trace it to the root. In the most recent list, one case from 3 years ago made Evelyn pause longer than usual. A young man named Malik Harper, 17, had been charged with assaulting an arresting officer, Nathan Briggs. The defense attorney had filed a motion to check the body cam footage because Malik claimed he was beaten while not resisting. The result? The camera had lost signal. The prosecutor dismissed the motion. Malik received probation and a permanent mark on his record. Who was the prosecutor on that case? Evelyn asked. A name appeared, Tobias Langley. She didn't have to look far to find Langley's name in at least 6 other cases where video footage was mysteriously lost, all involving Briggs. When she requested a deeper investigation, the outlines of a cover-up network started to become clear. Former Commander Raymond Blake, Briggs's former direct superior, had signed off on multiple reports that lacked evidence. ADA Langley, a seasoned prosecutor closely connected to several officers in the district, frequently declined to prosecute misconduct cases citing lack of basis. IT technician Ronald D., in charge of the surveillance camera system, had previously been complained about for suspicious tampering, but no one ever pursued the case. Evelyn stood. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her actions were already too loud to ignore. I want all cases showing signs of misconduct turned over to the Independent Judicial Review Committee, she told her clerk, and I want a preliminary report in 48 hours. The silence in the room at that moment wasn't out of respect for her title, but out of respect for her courage. The courage of a 63-year-old woman, not just willing to confront an abusive officer, but determined to dismantle the rotten bricks of an entire broken wall. Meanwhile, in the Internal Case Review Office, investigators were seeing for the first time a case list not shredded or buried but laid open page by page. And this time they knew. The person issuing the order wasn't someone they could brush off. This time the one giving the order was Evelyn Cross. And she didn't come to ask for permission. She came to begin. The Brookhaven courthouse was gradually settling into silence, with only a few dim lights from the upper floors casting reflections onto the plaza at the entrance. Inside her office, Judge Evelyn Cross had not yet left her seat. On the desk lay a thick stack of case files. But what weighed on her wasn't their quantity, it was their nature. Not merely records of individual misconduct, but the traceable outlines of a corrupt system, sustained by silence and well-timed nods. A soft knock echoed at the door. It was Terrence Liu, an internal investigator from the State Judicial Inspector General's office, someone who had once worked with Evelyn on a state-level case more than a decade ago. In his hands was a thin folder, but his face could not conceal the tension. "Preliminary report on Brookhaven as you requested," he said. "But Judge, I have to warn you, it's not easy reading." Evelyn accepted it, her eyes never leaving Terrence's gaze. "I don't need easy, I need the truth." She turned to the first page. Familiar names appeared immediately. Officer Nathan Briggs, Prosecutor Tobias Langley, former Commander Raymond Blake. But those were just the surface. Beneath them was a web of connections, a network tying together cases with signs of evidence tampering, deleted footage, coerced pleas, and even evaded investigations when the victims were people of color or from low-income communities. "I cross-referenced every case from 2008 to now," Terrence said, his voice low. "At least 27 cases involve missing evidence, suspicious witness reversals, or altered autopsy reports. Briggs was directly or indirectly involved in 23 of them." Evelyn furrowed her brow. "And what kept these cases hidden for so long?" Terrence slowly pointed to a special tab in the folder. "Restricted oversight communications, judicial access only." Evelyn opened it. Inside were audio transcripts, some distorted, others chillingly clear of conversations between high-ranking officers, prosecutors, and even mid-level judges. All shared the same tone. "Clean up the file, it's not worth the noise. You know how to write that report. Don't get the committee involved. He's from Southside, who cares?" Each word felt like a knife cutting into the soul of her profession. Evelyn clenched the file, though her voice remained steady. "Any signs of bribery?" Terrence nodded. "Linked accounts through the Brookhaven Security Fund. Part of the money was funneled through shell law firms, then redirected to the individuals involved as so-called consulting fees. I verified at least 4 transactions tie back to Prosecutor Langley." Evelyn leaned back in her chair. The light above cast shadows across her face, making her look both exhausted and resolute. She had presided over countless trials, witnessed countless injustices, seen truths twisted. But this time she understood. This was no longer just an investigation. It was a reckoning. "And if I proceed with a public hearing?" she asked. "Judge Cross," Terrence replied, "you'll be confronting people who've built their careers on avoiding the truth. They won't go quietly." Evelyn was silent for a long moment. Then she stood, walking to the window that overlooked the glowing city of Brookhaven. Out there were people who had lived their whole lives believing in justice even if they had never seen its face. "Then it's time someone made sure they did," she said. "And if I'm the first to pay the price, then I'll pay it in honor." At that moment, a breeze slipped through the slightly open window, bringing with it the chill of the approaching night. But in Evelyn's eyes there was only light, the light of a day when the truth would no longer be buried. Because this system may be rotten, but she was still here, and she had started striking at the root. The sky over Brookhaven turned a pale gray, as if heralding an approaching storm. On the third floor of the courthouse, Judge Evelyn Cross had just signed a set of documents to be sent to the Department of Justice when her personal phone vibrated softly. A strange message. No sender name, just a string of anonymous numbers. She opened it and froze. It was a photo. In the picture, a brown-skinned boy stood in front of Roosevelt Elementary School, a red backpack on his back, a bag of cookies in his hand, completely carefree. It was Samuel, her grandson. The accompanying message contained only 4 chilling words. "Do you know what you're doing?" Evelyn didn't flinch. She had lived long enough to recognize these types of threats. But this was no longer an attack on her reputation. This was a threat to her flesh and blood. And it made her angrier than any courtroom had ever made her feel. She set the phone down and called Carter, her longtime personal assistant and the most trusted member of her legal security team. Her voice was firm, without a hint of hesitation. "Contact the U.S. Marshals immediately. I want a covert protection unit for the family. And Carter, transfer Samuel to a private school temporarily. Absolutely no press." Within less than an hour, the federal task force had arrived. They discreetly coordinated with the courthouse's security, installed cameras, tightened control at entry points, and compiled a list of individuals with a history of unauthorized access. But while the legal hallways were tightening, the media front was unraveling. On local news station WNBH, a surprise special report aired during prime time. Judge Evelyn Cross, leader of the Internal Reform Campaign, was once accused of bias in a 2009 case. On screen, they repeatedly aired footage of her at a charity event in a predominantly black neighborhood, quoting vague and unverified memos from a dismissed lawsuit years ago. Extremist political forums began spreading the hashtag #crossout, falsely accusing her of politicizing the judiciary, betraying the justice system, even inciting racial division. Evelyn watched it all in silence. Some advised her to step back, avoid the media, take a step back for the sake of the system's image. But she knew. Stepping back now would mean allowing the darkness to win again. And she hadn't dedicated 40 years of her career just to turn a blind eye to the truth. The next day, in a closed-door meeting with representatives from the Department of Justice, she issued an official request. "I am calling for a full federal investigation into the Brookhaven Police Department, the state prosecutor's office, and any personnel ever connected to cases showing signs of serious civil rights violations." The government representative, a woman named Kwan, looked at her with a mix of skepticism and respect. "Are you sure you want to go this far?" Evelyn nodded without hesitation. They had the audacity to track a 7-year-old child just to protect their privilege. "I won't stop until every decayed piece of their armor is stripped away." The room fell silent for a few moments. That wasn't just a statement. It was a vow. Later that night, upon returning home, Evelyn found a bouquet of white flowers on her porch. No name, no card, just a small note. "There are still people who stand with you." The night breeze slipped through the slightly open window, carrying a chill. But inside the room, a flame was burning quietly, resiliently. Because Evelyn Cross was no longer alone, and she was no longer afraid. On Monday morning, the Brookhaven courthouse gleamed under the early week sunlight, but the atmosphere was taut as a tightened string. Outside, a long line of people queued in front of the main entrance, holding signs, documents, and eyes filled with anticipation. Dozens of reporters from major television networks, national radio stations, and independent newspapers pointed their cameras toward the courthouse doors, where a special public hearing was about to begin. Anonymous messages still simmered on forums, but the silence had been broken. Threats no longer held power once light had pierced the deepest shadows. Judge Evelyn Cross, 63 years old, composed and resolute, entered the courtroom in a dark suit without her judicial robe. Today, she wasn't representing a title, but the truth. She walked to the bench, her eyes sweeping the packed courtroom. Federal representatives, local prosecutors, the police chief, the press, past victims, and even those who had once remained silent. Her voice was low, clear. Today, we are not judging one individual, but confronting the system that allowed him to exist. The large screen behind her lit up with the title, Preliminary Investigation Report, Internal Misconduct Ties Within Brookhaven Justice. Carter, her longtime personal assistant, stood beside her, handing over each document. Evelyn read each name, each title aloud. Officer Nathan Briggs, 12 allegations of excessive force, 7 complaints disappeared after being filed. Assistant Prosecutor Raymond Sutter refused to prosecute at least 6 cases with clear evidence of police abuse. Former Judge Leon Whitmore dismissed appeals in cases showing serious misconduct, including one involving a wrongly convicted black teenager who served nearly 10 years. Each name spoken was like a blow to a wall once thought untouchable. In the courtroom, no one dared even to cough. There were only camera clicks, reporter keystrokes, and the loud thumping of hearts in the chests of those who had long been treated as invisible. Then she revealed evidence of a secret fund, the Justice Honor Protection Fund, run by a group of retired officers and local politicians, designed to quietly settle misconduct cases. The list of contributors included many high-ranking officials from both the police department and the Justice Office. "This isn't a matter of a few bad apples," Evelyn said, her gaze unwavering. "This is a pot that's been sealed too long, where the wrong is shielded by power and the right is silenced by procedure." Behind her, Agent Rosalind Kwan, a representative of the Department of Justice, nodded in agreement. "We are officially proposing a structural overhaul of Brookhaven's justice system, from independent investigations to personnel selection, with direct federal oversight for a minimum of 18 months. The news instantly spread across the state of Georgia. On evening television broadcasts, the anchor opened with, "From one slap, a shockwave of justice has spread." Neighboring towns like Augusta, Columbus, and Valdosta began requesting internal reviews of their own justice departments. Law students organized forums titled, "Justice is Not Afraid of Light." National media praised Evelyn Cross as a rare figure of dignity and resolve. On social media, the hashtags #WakeUpBrookhaven and #JusticeWithCross trended at lightning speed. Black citizens who had long suffered in silence began sharing their stories. Those previously dismissed for lack of evidence now had a platform to be heard. Carter looked at her from behind the bench and gave a small nod. No words were needed, they both understood. This was not the end, but the beginning of an era in which the law no longer stood with power, but with truth. Evelyn murmured to herself, just loud enough for her own ears. At last, the light has a chance to do its work. More than a month after the public hearing that shook the entire state of Georgia, a special trial was held at the federal courthouse in the capital, Atlanta, not to resolve an ordinary case, but to bring to light those who once stood above the law, those who believed they would never be held accountable. At the center of the trial was a name long shielded from consequences, Officer Nathan Briggs. This time, the defendant's chair wasn't reserved for Briggs alone. Sitting beside him were Assistant Prosecutor Raymond Sutter, former Judge Leon Whitmore, and 3 police officers who had worked under Briggs in various shady investigations. 6 individuals, but behind them stood an entire network that had operated silently for nearly 2 decades. That day, the courtroom was filled to capacity. National media scrambled to get the best camera angles. Former victims, those falsely accused, beaten, even wrongfully convicted, sat in the front row, their eyes filled with both anger and hope. And walking into the courtroom, dressed simply yet exuding authority, was Judge Evelyn Cross, not as the presiding judge today, but as the trial's most important witness. She didn't need a robe. With her steady walk, unwavering gaze, and calm voice, she commanded absolute silence as she stood to take the oath. The prosecutor asked, "Can you describe exactly what happened that morning in the Brookhaven courtroom?" Evelyn nodded, not looking at the defendants, but directly at the panel of judges. "I entered the courtroom to prepare for a preliminary hearing. I had not yet donned my judicial robe, but I was still a judge. Officer Nathan Briggs not only failed to recognize me, but spoke with contempt, demeaning my gender, my race, and when I asked him to maintain order, he slapped me in the courtroom, in front of witnesses and security cameras. No hesitation, no wasted words. Her statement dropped like the hammer of justice. That slap wasn't the beginning, she continued. It was the final straw, the moment that exposed a broken system. The prosecution played the surveillance footage. The courtroom fell silent as the video showed Briggs raising his hand and slapping her. Then came a series of pieces of evidence collected by Evelyn's team in the following weeks. Audio recordings, copies of buried case files, emails between involved parties suggesting collusion. Briggs's defense attorneys tried to frame it as a misunderstanding, a momentary lapse in emotional control. But each time such excuses were voiced, Evelyn's eyes remained unchanged, calm, resolute, and wholly unyielding to deceit. Carter, her loyal assistant, sat in the gallery, eyes fixed on every word she spoke. He knew she wasn't just speaking for herself, but for the hundreds who never had a chance to stand in court and tell their truth. Finally, after 4 tense days of trial, the verdict was delivered. In a sentencing broadcast live across the country, the federal chief judge declared, Nathan Briggs, guilty of assaulting a judicial officer, abuse of power, and collusion to conceal evidence, is sentenced to 25 years in prison without parole. Raymond Sutter, guilty of professional misconduct and selective prosecution, is sentenced to 15 years. Leon Whitmore, guilty of complicity and judicial misconduct, is permanently disbarred and sentenced to 12 years in prison. The other defendants received proportionate sentences, but those verdicts were only the surface. The tremors of the trial extended far beyond. Across Georgia, judicial panels were ordered to review all files linked to the newly convicted. The Federal Committee for Judicial System Reform was established. Law schools hosted symposiums titled, When Justice Speaks from the Witness Stand. And in the back of the courtroom, the public rose in applause not out of joy, but out of reverence. For a 63-year-old woman who didn't use her power to retaliate, but used the truth to illuminate a corrupted system. As the trial concluded, Evelyn stepped out of the courtroom, the afternoon sun casting a soft glow over her shoulders. She didn't smile, she only gave a small nod. Justice had spoken, and this time, it didn't whisper. It roared. After the historic trial, Brookhaven suddenly became unusually quiet. The crowds that once jostled outside the courthouse had thinned out. Headlines gradually shifted to other stories. But on the top floor of the federal courthouse, where light streamed through thick glass windows, there was still one woman preparing for her final chapter. Judge Evelyn Cross, 63 years old, entered the conference room with her final folder in hand. It wasn't a new case nor a report. It was her resignation letter, handwritten, with each slanted letter as steady and deliberate as her life had always been. She sat down and looked around the room that had been the center of so many hearings she had presided over. The same dark wooden table, the same high-backed chair that symbolized justice. But today, it was no longer where Evelyn belonged. At the press conference that followed, she stood beneath the glare of camera lights and dozens of reporters. The calmness on her face hushed the crowd before she even spoke. I am not here to bask in the spotlight of a high-profile trial. I am here to close one chapter and open another for this city. Her voice was steady, but it carried the weight of a manifesto. I officially resign from my position as judge of the Brookhaven Court, effective today. There was no applause, only silence, not the silence of indifference, but of respect. Many in the room had hoped she would stay, continue to lead. But Evelyn knew, some bridges must be built by new hands. But Evelyn did not walk away quietly. Immediately after announcing her resignation, she unveiled a new initiative, the True Justice Campaign, a 5-year reform program founded and overseen by her. The goals were clear: review all cases previously contested for lack of transparency, train new judges and prosecutors under strict ethical standards, establish an independent judicial oversight board including community representatives, civil rights attorneys, and academics. In her final remarks, she looked straight into the camera. I am not resigning to leave justice behind. I am resigning so justice can grow free from names, titles, or tenure. Justice does not need heroes. It needs gatekeepers, quiet, steadfast, and transparent. That afternoon, Evelyn left the Brookhaven courthouse for the last time, not as the woman in the black robe, but as a grandmother, a citizen, a living witness to a pivotal turning point in local history. The car took her back to the southern suburbs, where a small wooden house nestled among a grove of trees. There, a little boy was riding his bicycle around the yard, greeting her with a joyful shout. "Grandma Evelyn, you're home!" She smiled, opened her arms, and embraced her grandson tightly without saying a word. That warmth that moment was the greatest reward she had ever received. That evening, as the city lit up, she sat on her porch with a cup of ginger tea in hand while the radio softly played the news bulletin. The True Justice campaign officially launched this morning, with participation from over 30 young judges. She said nothing, just nodded gently, her gaze fixed on the horizon where justice, though once obscured, had never ceased to shine. This was not an ending, it was a beginning. The story of Judge Evelyn Cross is not a loud victory. It is a reminder that justice does not arrive on its own. It needs someone to stand up, even at the age of 63. It takes a single slap to expose an entire rotten system, and it needs one calm, strong woman brave enough to say, "No one stands above the law, not even those who wear a badge." She resigned, leaving the seat of power to the next generation. But she did not walk away from the fight. She simply chose a different battlefield where truth is nurtured by belief, and justice is rewritten with resolve. Do you believe that truth is still worth protecting, even when it makes the powerful tremble? Like this video if you believe justice cannot be silenced. Share this story if you want more people to know that silence is never the answer. And subscribe to the channel to follow us through stories of courage, truth, and those who refuse to bow down. Because sometimes, it only takes one person standing up to change the entire system.